more about LockBit in the news.
Known for its defense and space contracts, Boeing confirmed this development after the LockBit cybercrime group issued a ransom threat. ICBC Financial Services says it is conducting an investigation and recovery is in progress. Suspicions are falling on a group known as LockBit.
LockBit has released the data it stole from Royal Mail, along with private chats between the two.
LockBit, the largest ransomware group, they have a leak site where they claimed an attack. And the attack that they claimed was that they had attacked TSMC. The request for ransom was $70 million.
LockBit has caused enormous harm and cost. No longer. Today we can announce that the National Crime Agency has successfully infiltrated and fundamentally disrupted LockBit.
This was something new, and this was extremely significant because at the end of the day, even though most of these actors are from a specific country themselves, and they feel like they are not extremely touchable or accessible from an arresting point of view, etc., but still they don't enjoy the heat. And they always take the more passive approach of law enforcement for granted. However, this particular way of dealing with them, especially under the scope of Cronos, first of all, it messed with their psychology a lot. That I can tell you directly.
Welcome to Deep Dive from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. I'm Jack Megan-Vickers. And this is this the end of LockBit? Back in October 2021, Recorded Future published an exclusive interview with LockBit Sup, the apparent leader of LockBit, at the time already a prominent ransomware-as-a-service provider. In the interview they were asked how they became so successful. LockBit Sup said,
"The secret is very simple, an impeccable reputation. We are the only ones who have never scammed anyone or changed our brand. People trust us."
Now let's fast forward to the 20th of February this year. I saw a tweet which immediately made me sit up. It was from the UK's National Crime Agency, and it just said, "Official announcement in 4 hours, #Cronos." Along with the message was a picture. In the middle was a large countdown clock. On the top, a series of logos, the NCA, FBI, Europol and a bunch of others. In the top left corner, there was a circle of flags. France, Japan, Switzerland, Canada, Australia, Sweden, the Netherlands, Finland, Germany, the US and the UK. In the centre was the familiar red logo of LockBit, the biggest ransomware-as-a-service provider in the world. For the next few hours, a new image was released with the time on the clock slowly going down. 3 hours, 2 hours, 1 hour, and then the news dropped. LockBit's entire operation was in the hands of an international task force of law enforcement, known as Operation Cronos. The video ended with the message, "We know who they are and we will be watching," before the LockBit logo morphed into the logo of the NCA. So first things first, before we go any further, we did a previous episode on the Conti ransomware group last year, in which we cover a lot of the detail about ransomware and the ransomware-as-a-service model. If you don't know what that means, it's probably worth checking out that episode further down the podcast feed. Now, to that big reveal, because let's face it, it was pretty awesome. I genuinely loved the way Operation Cronos announced this success. It was inspired stuff. And I think even cybercriminals would have a begrudging respect at the levels of trolling involved. After the countdown had finished, LockBit's usual data leak site, the place where they share all their criminal activities, had changed. Gone were the placeholders that displayed the name of the ransomware victim and the usual countdown timer. Instead, new placeholders had been created. For example, press releases with a picture of the UK, US and EU flags. LockBit backend leaks with an image of the NCA logo. LockBit decryption keys. And then you had one with the title LockBit Sup, the name of the leader of LockBit. Underneath it simply said, "You've been banned from LockBit 3.0, and many, many more, including the logo of Prodaft, a threat intelligence company we've spoken to before.
That's one of the areas that we can probably take credit. I think we were one of the first important forces that has put LockBit in the radar of different organizations, of law enforcement as a key future threat.
This is Koryak Uzan, one of the co-founders of Prodaft, who helped law enforcement in Operation Cronos. Koryak oversees different operations under Prodaft's threat intel branch's umbrella, and they have been monitoring LockBit for years. In fact, the leader of LockBit gave Prodaft a special mention, a tip of the hat, if you will, in their statement to VX Underground a few days after the operation was revealed.
The way that it was revealed, I think it was quite positive. From a psychological point of view on the threat actor side, there are 196 affiliates that we are talking about who are distributed in different parts of the world, right? It's not physically possible to arrest all of them, even though you know the IDs all of them. So one of the best things in your toolkit as LE, I think it would be really making it as discouraging as possible to really mess with the psychology of the threat actors, which I think played out nicely. By the way, it's not my place to tell which one is better, but usually when you just put out a press release or a public statement, it just loses the entire impact or effect after the first 24 hours, and everything really tends to get back to what they were really quickly. This was a lot different, and all you need is the suspicion to plant the suspicion psychologically. And when you have a list of all the affiliates or a lot of different details that you can publish, which doesn't include any kinds of private third-party information or anything. So ethically, I don't see a problem with that. Those were all just produced nicknames, nothing else. I think it made a lot of sense. So trying out something new is always good.
And we'll come back to Operation Cronos in a little bit, but first let's talk about LockBit. Why was this takedown such a big deal? So LockBit operates a ransomware-as-a-service model. They provided the platform, infrastructure and tools for other threat actors or individual affiliates to carry out ransomware attacks. And they are the biggest ransomware-as-a-service provider in the world.
So LockBit itself has started recruiting different affiliates, providing them the software that they're going to be using, the infrastructure that they're going to be using. Only thing that they would require is to try to perform intrusive actions to potential targets and then lock their infrastructure. So in terms of this as a service model, that's what's the most important thing about LockBit. So LockBit gained really significant interest, especially they were quite aggressive. And in our report, dated, if I'm not wrong, 2021, we were able to, even that day, map out some significant, important things about their operation, how their particular locker software is working, how the affiliate model was working, how many affiliates were there back then. We also published the list of affiliates in that report as well. And frankly, in that investigation, we were able to reach the keys of multiple hundreds of victims back then. And of course, we have shared this entire procedure with law enforcement as well, which eventually ended up with saving hundreds of different victims back in the day. But in terms of how professional the LockBit management was approaching this as a service issue, it were giving us the signs that they're going to be huge in the future as well. Because they were adopting this methodology of not hacker group or a dark brand, but an actual genuine company.
LockBit operate as a kind of business, albeit a criminal one. For example, they had a bug bounty campaign. They were essentially asking hackers to find vulnerabilities in its code. Its advert said,
"We invite all security researchers, ethical and unethical hackers on the planet to participate in our bug bounty program. The amount of remuneration varies from $1,000 to $1 million.
Just for context, this is the same thing that tech companies like Google and Microsoft offer: financial reward for discovering vulnerabilities. They also did promotional campaigns, like saying that they would pay anyone $1,000 if they get the LockBit logo tattooed on their bodies. And yes, a number of people did. Now, usually ransomware-as-a-service providers would get the entire victim ransom payment and then pay the majority to the affiliate. At least that's the idea. But then these are cybercriminals, so occasionally they, well, don't. For example, back in 2021, DarkSide, the ransomware-as-a-service gang behind the infamous Colonial Pipeline attack, were taken to a cybercrime court by unpaid and disgruntled affiliates. But what makes LockBit different from other ransomware-as-a-service providers was a simple but important distinction. Affiliates collected the successful ransom payment and then they would pay LockBit 20%. Not to mention that the development of the LockBit platform was consistent and highly customizable for those using it. Prominent security researcher John DiMaggio, who infiltrated LockBit, said the system was so easy to use that he could have taught his kids to use it. And that brings me to the ransomware group Conti, who dramatically disintegrated in early 2022, a subject we covered in a lot more detail last year in another episode. Now, one of the winners from Conti's demise was LockBit, who rose to take its place as the leading ransomware-as-a-service provider. For 2 years, LockBit has been the top dog. At one point, such was the popularity of the LockBit platform, it began to buckle under the pressure of data storage issues and latency. According to Cisco Talos Intelligence Group, LockBit accounted for 25% of ransomware deployments in 2023.
The guys that we know from the Conti investigation, that we were able to detect them to be exactly deploying LockBits. They were acting as the same groups of 5, 6, 7, 10, the same guys, using the same methodologies, with the same nicknames, talking about their old days and deploying LockBits. So it looks like after the Conti has become dismantled, at least multiple groups of individuals from the ex-Conti group started deploying LockBit.
So former Conti members splintering off into smaller groups began using LockBit. And this is a really important point because without arrests of individuals, often ransomware operators simply dismantle, rebuild and rebrand and start at it all over again. Conti was a beast, and those criminal actors behind it are still operating. When it comes to LockBit, the connections between former Conti operators are unmistakable. You can even see this in the LockBit product itself, because there are different versions of LockBit. So LockBit Green, Black, Red, and so on. LockBit Green is particularly interesting.
So LockBit Green is particularly developed. I really don't know if it's by or if it's for the Conti guys. So we can say LockBit Green is the new Conti. And from my understanding, and this is just logically not based on any detection or anything, but Conti group itself is very skilled. So it's an amazing asset for the LockBit brand overall. So therefore, it makes sense to make them happy as well. So I think that's why the LockBit Green is particularly developed for those guys.
Speaking to Bleeping Computer, Prodaft suggested that former Conti members specifically use LockBit Green because they probably feel comfortable using Conti-based ransomware. Incorporating the work of Conti is not unique for LockBit. Another version known as LockBit Black, otherwise known as LockBit 3.0, this encryptor stems from the source code of the ransomware gang Black Matter, themselves a rebrand of DarkSide, and now known as Black Cat. Another highly skilled and prominent cybercriminal group that utilised LockBit is Fin7.
Fin7 on its own is not a ransomware group originally. So they were this very old school, I may say the elite level of APT groups and threat actors, which were really after intrusion into the banking system and then taking the money out or mess with the entire card management services or backbone or transaction management services inside the banking organization, make the authorization of transaction impossible. And then, they were after these kind of very elaborate attacks. And we have seen them multiple times on site or with our own visibility into different infrastructures, etc. So, that's what Fin7 was. But it's also very illogical for them to continue with that, because at the end of the day, their old intrusion tactics and those kind of money exfiltration was too much work. So they started to rebrand themselves as a ransomware group, and their choice was LockBit. So we already know that Fin7 was deploying LockBit. The same thing goes with Evil Corp. There are other attributions as well, by the way, because this is a very transient market, which means that most of the groups that we are talking about today are deploying multiple ransomware variants at the same time.
It's interesting when Kordiak talks about the transient nature of the market. There's an alleged affiliate of LockBit called Mikhail Matveev. He was sanctioned by the US in May 2023, and according to the US, he worked with LockBit and Hive, and is alleged to be one of the developers of the Babuk ransomware. In an interview with Recorded Future, Matveev spoke about the wider ransomware landscape, in which he said that Conti are particularly well run, and LockBit, or groups like REvil, they tend to claim others' work as their own. Matveev's view of LockBit is indicative of a wider view of this group, because despite its size and impact, LockBit Sup, the guy running the show, did not have a great reputation within the cybercriminal landscape. LockBit Sup got in a dispute with the developer of LockBit 3.0, or LockBit Black. Remember that it had the same source code as Black Matter, and that's because the developer was the same. That bug bounty program spotted the same vulnerability in LockBit 3.0 that had been found in Black Matter. The bounty of $50,000 was paid out, but LockBit Sup demanded that the developer pay, who refused, and instead the developer leaked the LockBit source code, which meant its code could be used and modified by other cybercriminals without paying LockBit. Before the takedown, LockBit Sup was banned from two of the most prominent and important Russian-speaking forums, XSS and Exploit. Now, these are not just a free-for-all, they have arbitration features available to members who want to file a complaint. Apparently, an initial access broker, the person who found a way into a system, raised a complaint that LockBit had extorted the victim without sharing the profit. The admin of the site ruled that LockBit had to share 10% of the profits. LockBit Sup said no and was promptly banned. Analyst 1 did some great work on this. They reported that LockBit Sup was also given the status of Ripper on the Exploit forum. Apparently, this is a terrible indictment and signals a lack of trust. Needless to say, LockBit Sup has denied the charges and said that it wasn't a fair hearing and they will not be blackmailed. So LockBit Sup took the appeal to the Russian-speaking dark web ransomware forum RAMP, which, to come full circle, was created by Boris Elksin, aka Wazawaka, aka Mikhail Matveev. Perhaps we should talk now a little bit about Operation Cronos. According to Europol, 10 countries are in this task force. 200 cryptocurrency accounts were frozen, 34 servers were taken down, 14,000 accounts were taken down. The NCA took control of the infrastructure and the leak site, and 3 affiliates were arrested, 1 in Poland and a father and son in Ukraine. The coordination required to carry out this operation is remarkable, and maybe the only way to tackle cybercriminal actors as large as LockBit.
Any other way is not possible, by the way. So it's kind of like a requirement, basically, if you want to at least put a dent or put a stop in this entire thing. For example, not in this operation, but in multiple operations. You are usually dealing with a wide variety of machines which are distributed to multiple countries. And you have a list of suspects which are also distributed in multiple countries. And you need to match all of these together. So any other way is not basically possible. And if you look at the most prominent takedowns of the last 4, 5, 6 years, mainly all of them are a result of such cooperations. Of course, it's not my place to even evaluate how this tactical or task force teams inside each law enforcement organization operate, or how deeply that they are exchanging information in between each other. But as far as I can say, they are doing their best to share information to the extent which is acceptable according to their own organizational limitations. And I'm sure it continues to be so, or else it's virtually impossible. I mean, your entire chain of investigation would be dead at the first step if you don't have that kind of cooperation, because at least 15 different countries should always be involved when you're dealing with groups such as LockBit because of their diverse infrastructures.
Alongside this, the United States Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, sanctioned 2 alleged affiliates of LockBit, both Russian nationals. One was a man called Ivan Kondratiev, an infamous hacker better known as Bastard, who literally wrote the ransomware manual, selling it for about $10,000 a copy on underground forums. Prodaft actually managed to get hold of a copy. So law enforcement have been following LockBit for some time. So how significant is this takedown?
This was something new, and this was extremely significant because at the end of the day, even though most of these actors are from a specific country themselves, and they feel like they are not extremely touchable or accessible from an arresting point of view, etc., but still they don't enjoy the heat. And they always take the more passive approach of law enforcement for granted. However, this particular way of dealing with them, especially under the scope of Cronos, first of all, it messed with their psychology a lot. That I can tell you directly. Secondly, everybody knows that law enforcement has more data. And I'm not saying this because I know stuff. That's usually the way it is, by the way. Everybody thinks that law enforcement is usually following everything behind, but it's usually not the case. So this entire way of dealing with it, this publicly, has also created a concern for them. And especially we are right now also reading in the correspondences in between threat actors in underground platforms. They are just saying that they're really curious about what else and to what extent, how much more information that law enforcement currently have on each affiliate. Even though LockBit seems to be revamped at the moment, which too early to tell, by the way, to reach a conclusion. However, I think the trust between affiliates and the LockBit management has received a significant damage. And it's something that once you have these kind of suspicions, it's very difficult to eliminate those.
Despite the takedown, LockBit has tried to regain its position. About a week later, a new leak site had been created and shock horror LockBit SUP was giving interviews again. Now, before I tell you what LockBit SUP said, remember that this person is a cyber criminal, and these people sometimes bend the truth a little. In a rambling statement sent to VX Underground, which began with,
"What happened?"
LockBit SUP admitted that,
"Due to my personal negligence and irresponsibility, I relaxed and did not update PHP in time."
a rare bit of contrition perhaps. Well, not really, because in the previous paragraph, LockBit SUP said,
"I didn't pay much attention to it because for 5 years of swimming in money, I became very lazy and continued to ride on a yacht with titsy girls."
I remember once speaking to a ransomware expert who told me that ransomware operators always think their operational security is much better than it is in reality. So yes, some form of LockBit is still operational. It's still too early to say if this is the beginning of the end or just a significant setback for this cybercriminal behemoth. But will we see a fragmentation, similar to what we saw with the likes of Conti?
First of all, the financial resources of LockBit is quite huge. Still, even though it's damaged, they have a brand as well. So therefore, I wouldn't say it's impossible for LockBit to make a comeback. However, I know that I'm not saying much because it's just too soon to tell. Because, for example, LockBit blog has been live again. We have seen that some of the new victims were not, in fact, new victims themselves. So it felt like they are using some of the old credit or trying extra hard to make them look like they are still the king and nothing has been done, etc., which seems to be not the case very much. So therefore, I wouldn't say the end of LockBit because it takes a lot of time for a large organization, LockBit, to exactly diminish. However, I think LockBit will continue. I'm not sure about it growing, but of course they will continue as a brand, at least for quite some more time. However, I'm very confident that a lot of different groups will divert off from LockBit. And the new alternative, it's very soon to tell who this may be, but an alternative which comes out as a lot more trustworthy, technically a lot more anonymous or a lot more distributed. If they manage to create a very nice brand, they can transfer or poach multiple different affiliates of LockBit under their own umbrella.
Cybercrime, ironically, is built on trust and reputation. But unfortunately, these are not people who can be trusted. This is why exit scams are so prevalent. For example, just days after LockBit's takedown, messages from angry affiliates began appearing on underground forums, these ones directed towards the Black Cat ransomware group. They'd been in a cat and mouse game with law enforcement for some time. Their data leak site was taken down by law enforcement in December 2023, but the group seemed to seize it back. Then on the 1st of March, they received a sizable $22 million ransom from a company in the US. 2 days later, the affiliate involved complained to a forum that they'd not received their portion of the payment, and the administrators couldn't be reached. More complaints appeared over the next 24 hours until suddenly, all affiliate accounts were closed. Black Cat's source code was put up for sale, $5 million for those interested, and then what appears to have been a fake law enforcement seizure notice appeared on their data leak site. Indeed, the NCA in the UK even confirmed that they had nothing to do with it. So ransomware as a service has some issues, trust being one of them. And that is why we've seen in recent years a new trend, perhaps a much more dangerous one, and that's what's called closed groups. These are much more difficult to penetrate because they don't follow the ransomware as a service model. They are private criminal enterprises. Outsiders can't gain access.
We know we already detected multiple groups that operate in the exact fashion that you have described. Very close individuals, 8-9 people. They are working alongside each other exactly like a CTF team, and even I personally suspect them of being a CTF team themselves. And they become quite successful. So that's always something that we can expect. And especially after this, I won't say there will be 190 something groups will be instantly transformed to these individual small subgroups. However, of course, it would be logical to assume that some percentage of them definitely will. And depending on their current skill set, some of them may emerge with their own unique brand. And two of the most notorious actors, by the way, currently that we can see on the media are operating in this exact same fashion, by the way. They're exactly like what you described.
Those two closed groups are Royal Ransomware, who are thought to have once been part of Conti, and Play Ransomware. Currently there is still an awful lot of money to be made in ransomware. Last year, Sophos wrote that the average ransom payment in 2023 was 1.5 million. But with regular and increasingly effective law enforcement action, and with the rise of more secure closed groups, could this spell a change in the long-term future for the ransomware as a service model?
I think ransomware as a service concept has a shelf life, which is, maybe a couple of years more, but not more than that, because there are a couple of factors. So it started with ransomware and ransomware as a service. While this was happening, it started from, let's say, encryption of data to double extortion. And then in the future, I think we will be looking at a a lot more distributed cyber underground, which means that I think instead of publicizing the data you have exfiltrated, I think some unique data brokering marketplaces will emerge. And at the end of the day, people will stop paying for sure. And sometimes the data that you have exfiltrated will become a lot more profitable or a lot more valuable, not for the person that owns the data, but for other organizations, governments, competitors, etc. So I think we are started picking up some signs of this transition. So instead of holding the owner of the data ransom, I think after exfiltrating or stealing the data, they will be recognizing the significance of this data, especially if the data is not belonging to some chocolate manufacturer, but from an extremely critical CNI. And then we start seeing this a lot more. And the common marketplaces of different ransomware groups will emerge. These will not care about any kind of public profile such as what LockBit is doing. And that's the way where things are moving. Because at the end of the day, the main reason that ransomware has become so popular is that unfortunately the industry has normalized paying for stuff. And even insurance companies were okay with paying a certain amount. So it's not a chicken and egg problem, by the way. This is the way it is. So if it was not legally possible to pay, then nobody would pay it. Then ransomware as a threat model wouldn't be this popular. If this happens, I think this will really accelerate the transition between data brokerage by means of ransom.
Not paying would be an effective strategy. I saw this news recently in The Guardian, and it was an interview with the British Library, who suffered a ransomware attack by Reseda in October last year, who demanded $600,000. The British Library refused to pay, citing, "Future attacks such as this on publicly funded institutions should be aware that the UK's national policy, articulated by the National Cybersecurity Centre, is unambiguously clear that no such payments should be made." And you see, even paying the ransom doesn't return everything back to normal. It can take months to recover systems, and according to Sophos, on average costs $1.82 million. Aside from that, we know that LockBit kept data even after payments were made, despite saying it would be deleted, which means, again imagine my surprise, they lied. Ransomware groups regularly use double or triple extortion methods. So what now? LockBit wrote in that statement about why they do what they do.
I love my work. It brings me joy from life. Money and luxury do not bring such joy as my work. That's why I am ready to risk my life for the sake of my work. That's how bright, rich, and dangerous life should be, in my opinion.
But despite the blasé attitude, this public loss of face must have stung, and regaining that trust is not going to be easy. And I think coming out and saying,
I became very lazy,
doesn't help assuage concerns now or in the future. So LockBit, this powerhouse of the ransomware world, is this the beginning of the end?
People are extremely quick to jump to a conclusion, but especially with LockBit, I think many people are not able to grasp how big, how resourceful of an organization that we're talking about. So it's still there. However, it received significant damage for sure. But I think in the next couple of months, it would be a lot easier to tell what to expect.
That's it for this episode of Deep Dive. I'd like to thank Koryak from Prodaft for speaking to us. If you want to hear more about ransomware, we did an episode on the rise and fall of Conti last year. You'll find the link to that episode in the podcast notes or further down this podcast feed. There you'll also find a load of links to various papers, research and news articles related to this episode. For more information about our work here at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime, head over to our website globalinitiative.net, where we release our latest research into organised crime around the world. This has been Deep Dive from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. I'm Jack Megan Vickers. Thanks for listening.